Hi everyone, so today I'm going to go over how you can get a 7 on your IB Econ Micro IA in very little time. So a lot of people think that your Econ IA is like a lot of your other IAs where you need to work on it for weeks in order to get a 7, but this isn't the case. You can follow these steps and get a 7 on your Micro IA even at the last minute. So the first step is to obviously find the right article. If you're short on time, I recommend doing one of these topics that lend themselves really well to evaluation points. So one of these are excise taxes, or really any measure that is used to correct a form of market failure, because market failure allows you to present different measures that could have been taken to maybe better address the negative externality or positive externality. Another tip is to find an article that is not any longer than a page long or not any shorter. So a page and a half is the optimum length, and you also want to look at an article that doesn't do all the work for you. Most of your points for the IA are partly definitions but also evaluation, so you don't want an article that is already evaluating the measure so much that there's nothing new that you can add. So find an article that is more descriptive rather than about evaluation. So for this video I've chosen an article about excise taxes in Mexico. I'll leave the link in the description so you can take a read through it. But the next step is to annotate your chosen article. You really want to understand what your article is talking about. So highlight things that you think relate to economic theory, because you're going to get grades about how you can relate real life things to economic concepts, right? So I would suggest taking a moment to just highlight everything in the article that you think relates to something that you've learned in class, and also to keep in mind definitions that you want to present in your IA. Part of your grade is for the examiner to understand that you know how to use economic terms. This does not necessarily mean giving concrete definitions. You can give them in your own words, or you can simply just show that you know how to use them accurately. This is where a lot of students get points off. They use a lot of their word count, which isn't very big to begin with, it's only 750 words, to simply define economics terms, which you can just get in the textbook. They want to know that you can use these terms, not just define them. So let's begin annotating my article. So the first thing that my article mentions is that there has been an introduction of a sugary drinks tax to decrease the consumption of soft drinks because of the high level of diabetes and obesity that it causes. It also says the extent of the tax is 1 peso per liter. So in the introduction of my IA, which should only be 2 or 3 sentences, I'm going to briefly state what the article is about, right? So maybe define an excise tax as a compulsory levy to reduce the consumption of certain goods. Explain why this good is worth reducing. So talk about how it's a negative externality of consumption, which results in spillover costs to unrelated third parties in the form of obesity, diabetes. Also explain that this strains the healthcare services and reduces economic productivity, right? To make it clear what these spillover costs are. So I'm already up to the point where I can include a diagram for the negative externality of consumptions, and this is relevant. You have two options. You can simply include the taxes as part of the negative externality diagram, or if this seems too complicated, you can do it separately. Either way works fine. But you also want to integrate your diagram properly into the IA. You want to mention that there's an overconsumption. You want to mention the marginal external costs, right? The costs that are posed onto third parties. You want to mention the dead weight loss, and explain all of this in terms of the article, right? That the overconsumption results in obesity and such. And once you've properly integrated the diagrams and everything, this is when we move on to evaluation. And this is key. A lot of students waste so much of their word count explaining what's happening in the article instead of starting their evaluation. So if we were to find pros with the measure, we can first use our diagram to find these. So the tax has reduced the overconsumption, and because of the higher price has brought consumption closer to the social optimum quantity at Q star. This is also a market-based policy, and this is key. You want to review the pros and cons of dealing with market failure within your economics textbook. And one of the positives of taxes is that it internalizes the externality. By putting a higher price on the consumption of sugary drinks, it forces consumers to place the burden of the spillover costs, such as obesity, into their cost-benefit analysis, and therefore brings the marginal private benefits closer to the social optimum. Another benefit of this measure is tax revenue, and you also want to relate this to PED. So the more inelastic that PED is, the greater the tax revenue, right? Because tax revenue is just the extent of the tax times the quantity, and if PED is very inelastic, then quantity won't fall much in relation to an increase in the tax, and therefore the government revenue will be higher. You want to mention this. You can also say that it is beneficial because the government can use this tax revenue to directly compensate those that have been affected by the spillover costs, so such as investing or subsidizing the healthcare system. But you also want to reference pros that were found within the article. So the article does show that there's evidence of consumption following in relation to the tax, But the article also says that the greater fall in the consumption was shown in people of higher education rather than lower education, and this leads us on to our con. So this indicates that the tax might not be as effective because there is low level of education about the detrimental effects of sugary drinks, and this kind of suggests to us that maybe negative advertising would be a better solution rather than the tax. This is another key point to make. You can actually offer alternative measurements that you think would be better suited to fixing the market failure. So in negative advertising, the government can create campaigns to show the harmful nature of sugary drinks and therefore make it clear to consumers that the private benefits of consuming sugary drinks is not really that high, right? Because market failure and negative externalities of consumption result because of two things: time and consistent behavior, where consumers don't understand the negative effects that their consumption habits will have in the long term, and information failure, where consumers just simply don't understand how bad the demerit goods, the bad goods that they are consuming, are. So with negative advertising, we can actually shift the MPB curve closer to the MSB curve and therefore shifting it closer to the social optimum level. And by providing this alternative measurement, you can kind of show the examiner that you understand the different benefits and disadvantages of different measures. But what are more of the disadvantages of using a tax to fix this? Well, like we said before, the PED for sugary drinks is most likely highly inelastic because it's a broad definition. We're not just talking about Coca-Cola or Pepsi, we're talking about all sugary drinks. So it's going to take a very high tax to actually decrease the quantity demanded of the good significantly. Another key point to make is that a tax will never completely fix the externality unless we can actually accurately put a monetary value into the spillover cost that it has. In other words, we have to calculate the marginal external cost, the MEC, which is nearly impossible to do. So it's unlikely that we will ever find the specific amount of tax that will ever completely abolish the externality. Another problem with excise taxes is that it is regressive. It affects lower income households more than higher income households because the tax represents a greater proportion of the income of lower income households. Therefore, most of the people that will be affected by the tax are those in the low income aspect. Whereas the higher income households can simply continue their consumption because the tax isn't a big deal to them. And this can actually worsen income distribution and be considered as rather unfair. Another point that you should make to show that you're thinking deeply about the article is kind of question what the article is saying, right? So in this case, the article is using surveys to show that consumption has gone down since the implementation of the tax. But as we know, surveys are inaccurate because the respondents can either overpredict or underpredict how much their consumption has actually changed. So you want to question that. And the last step is your conclusion. So in your conclusion, you really want to give a definite statement about what you think should be done to fix this market failure. You want to concretely say, well, I think the tax is the best measure because it raises tax revenue, whereas negative advertising incurs great opportunity costs for the government because the government needs significant amounts of money to actually implement these campaigns. I would also say limit your conclusion to 2 or 3 sentences because there's not a lot of points that you can even get on your conclusion. Most of your IA should, again, be evaluation, but just don't stay in the in-between about which measure is best. Kind of give a conclusion about why a measure is best or not. And the last thing I want to say is that you should really review your economics textbook before starting your IA. If you're going to do your IA on market failure, take a look at the textbook, take a look at your notes so that you clearly understand market failure, and then your IA can be easily done. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I hope this was helpful. If you have any comments or suggestions about the next video, please leave a comment, and keep watching NGIB preparation to get the best possible IB grades that you can.